So I always like to start a talk with an artwork. This is a collaborative work by Byron Kim and Glenn Ligon in our collection at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. It is my favorite work in a public collection in the district and has been for a while. I didn't just drink the Kool-Aid. It so happens to be a great piece for this conversation because it explores issues of race, representation, diversity, and inclusion. But I won't tell you how. I'll let you think on that. So this visual demonstrates my framework for thinking about how inclusion is a practice and diversity is a realized truth that either exists or doesn't. In my practice, diversity is a realization of our efforts towards inclusion. It is a noun, not a verb. But when we attempt to diversify our work, we actually center our dominance and try to expand that dominant framework outwards. Think diversifying as you would your financial portfolio. Whereas inclusion, or an inclusive practice, aims to bring other voices into the center, thus creating a totally different structural center. But how do we develop a practice or a way of working and thinking that is inclusive? What are the key elements of an inclusive practice? For me, a participatory approach has been central towards instituting sustainable change. Though I'm sure the concept of participatory audience engagement is nothing new, I always want to credit the pioneers of this practice, namely Nina Simon's The Participatory Museum, which positions community voices in equal terms with museum scholarship, thus shifting the role of academic authority. Put very, very simply, in a participatory environment, audience engagement contributes to the foundation of knowledge and mutual understanding, and logistically, audience engagement makes up the mechanics of the program. In a truly participatory setting, if audiences aren't contributing, then the program is at a standstill. To illustrate my experiences with inclusion, I will walk through some career highlights, beginning with the Driscoll Center. The Driscoll Center is an intellectual home for artists, museum professionals, arts administrators, and scholars who are interested in broadening the field of African diasporic studies. The Driscoll Center is committed to collecting, documenting, and presenting African American art, as well as replenishing and expanding the field. The audience demographics are largely African Americans. Okay, now I did warn that I like a participatory presentation. So, any guesses as to which demographic listed here, you can call out the letter, was not an active community partner, not when I started at the Driscoll Center many, many, many moons ago. Did I hear any A's? The A's have it.
Really?
Okay.
Well, good that there were.
So, yes, if you can imagine, without active student engagement in a central campus institution, the museum was lacking a core community foundation in its mission to change the field of African American art history. So why weren't the students coming? After spending all day being lectured at, researching scholarship, taking exams, would you really want to spend your precious free time being told what African American art is? So we had to change the framework of our highly specialized, immensely intellectual, scholarly institution. Let that set in. We began by inviting student participation into the discussion of the American art canon, beginning with our first student community program, inviting students to discuss whose art canon is it, which became an ongoing brown bag discussion at lunchtime on Thursdays. Today, student groups take active part in the museum's programs, hosting poetry readings, tours, and community dialogue, but it had to start with a shift towards a more inclusive practice. In embracing an inclusive practice towards engaging student communities through participatory experiences, this led to a lasting shift in the community makeup of the Driscoll Center. In 2015, the National Museum of Women in the Arts launched a new activist initiative called Women, Arts, and Social Change. At the heart of this initiative is a new portfolio of public programs aimed at generating audience engagement around feminist issues and current events. The Fresh Talk series sought thought leaders across disciplines for dynamic panel discussions, like this one. Following panel discussions were either Sunday Supper, which is pictured here, or Catalyst. Both are designed as community dialogue spaces. Audiences respond to curated questions for deep critical thinking and strategizing solutions towards social change. This kind of participatory action was a first for the museum. I was brought into the initiative primarily for outreach. While this was a paid ticketed program, about half of the audience spaces were reserved free of charge for community partners to lead table discussions, such as you see here, around related topics. This was probably the first and only position I've ever held that was designed with such clear and specific goals in mind, namely audience cultivation. The museum had recently completed a multi-year audience evaluation with an outside firm. The results were that audiences, both engaging with the museum and local demographics who were decidedly not, both groups thought of the museum in a very specific way, as a place for ladies who lunch. Working with a branding firm, the museum was ready to launch a rebrand, specifically to target audiences of diverse heritage, of mostly millennial age ranges, and of the lean-in or professional young women communities. Thus, my goals were set. To achieve attendance in these demographics, I went out into the community and partnered with leaders at think tanks, community centers, book clubs, and other professional organizations. These partnerships grew into a mutual interest in providing space for critical thinking and dialogue around important, pressing issues. Through collecting evaluations from audiences, we began to gather data around the question, what do these audiences think or feel is important for social change right now? Which was both informative for the museum, but also to the community partners. Through setting mutually beneficial goals with community partners, we were able to achieve museum goals towards audience cultivation. After women arts and social change started gaining traction within the activist museum circuit, NAMAC, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, hired me to design a similar program for their audiences. Instead of audience cultivation, which NAMAC had already had, the museum was interested in different outcomes. As a widely popular, newly opened institution, NAMAC had the particularly nuanced challenge of an overwhelming sense of attention across a vast audience base. But with such a huge audience, there was a natural gap in service towards audience needs, specifically local activist audiences. From a programming perspective, the museum was interested in serving audiences in highly impactful and deeply meaningful ways through participatory dialogue programming. So I developed a seat at the table through a strategy of active institutional listening. Knowing that audiences were hungry for more and more and more and more from NAMAC, I turned my attention to the museum's social media feeds, the audience feedback cards, and other public-facing data pools to understand what audiences wanted, how we could give it to them, and in what ways NAMAC would become a central community platform. These methodologies of active institutional listening differ greatly from traditional evaluation tools. But working towards inclusion, especially empathetic inclusion, as NAMAC was, requires institutions to value platforms where communities are loudly and visibly engaging in discourse. Following much as the same format as Fresh Talk, a seat at the table audiences immediately reported transformational experiences or entering the program space feeling one way about an issue and leaving feeling another. But with active institutional listening as the framework, we heard groups of audiences seeking a different way to engage with social justice issues in a format less heavily relied on discussion and more geared towards personal development. So we took the format and turned it inside out. Instead of the focus on group discussion around curated deep thinking questions, we created an art-based experience for introverts, essentially, with Art Plus Justice. Art Plus Justice saw smaller audience numbers than a seat at the table, but that was okay because it was in service to a specific audience. In my experience, arts audiences have always been vocal about their expectations and their needs. We just haven't always had the institutional practice in place to hear them. Thus, active institutional listening as a practice became the way towards developing methodologies towards meaningful community impact. So finally, we land at my current role in institution as the head of public programs at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Renwick Gallery. As many Smithsonians are mandated to do, SAM pursues the challenge of exploring what it means to be an American. So after nearly a decade of working for new and fairly new organizations, now I find myself at an institution so old that it is, in fact, the first national public collection of American art. As such, audience cultivation and development is long established. These are two examples of our most popular programs, Take 5 and Handy Hour, which have, over the course of almost 10 years, cultivated audiences in the hundreds within the local jazz and craft appreciation communities. As an institution broadly interpreting the American experience, it is necessary that we regularly analyze our gaps in audience representation. Looking at our demographics, I've begun to develop a new outreach strategy to strengthen our relationships within our vastly diverse American communities. One program that has already gained traction is our community-curated Chinese New Year Family Day, where we partner with the current cultural attachés at the embassy to produce a day-long celebration bringing in Chinese national performers and artists and entertainers. As my first outreach-based program, we invited our peers from Howard, Namaque, and a Baltimore art gallery space to unpack the film Black is the Color, which aims to construct a linear narrative of the history of African American art, a venture not without its sizable problems. Knowing that the film presented some controversial narratives, we wanted to hear from our peers in their own voices. Instead of presenting the SAM-centered point of view, we highlighted representative voices of Black art scholarship. Typically, we get between 50 to 75 attendees for a film program. Black is the Color brought in over 250, mostly of African American descent. So looking forward, I'm in the midst of developing an inclusion policy for public programs, which I hope to roll out in early fall. My inclusive practice informs much of the work in developing such a policy, but whereas practice is the way in which we commit ourselves to doing better, policy holds us accountable. An inclusion policy gives us the framework to center our audience engagement strategy within the goals of cultivating new audiences, expanding outreach, and enhancing community partnerships. Ultimately, at the heart of the inclusion policy is the question of establishing brand identity. Who do we want to be? Or more importantly, with a mandate to explore the American experience through art, who do we need to be? Who do our audiences need us to be? So the point of this graphic is not to brag about my immense talent in creating infographics, but come see me if you'd like to hire me. No, the point of this visual is to demonstrate that inclusive practice is something that grows over time. It's something that needs to be nurtured and developed. After dedicating a career to inclusive practice, I am only now writing my first inclusion policy. But most importantly, inclusive practice requires a foundation from which to grow. One-off programming and checking a box for diversity does not provide the opportunity to grow into an inclusive institution. So I hope I've provided some possible solutions towards our mutual challenges in developing inclusive practice, but I always want to leave a talk with a question. For me, as a museum practitioner, the bigger question of inclusion is, what does inclusion look like in the 21st century museum? But for you, it's what does inclusion look like in the 21st century science or policy or healthcare or government or other organization? What does inclusion mean for your future? Thank you.